We are here on time. It's still morning. It's the bookless. It's not the bookless classroom. It's the reading room. Blah. Blah. The reading room. We are here with Dr. Get It Right, Annette Feravich, on day 201 in the classroom. And I'm so excited to get to our book again. God is Read. I read last hour. I'm reading this hour. I'm getting to be a really great reader. Thank God I don't mind it. Some things are harder than others, as we know. We are on chapter number 3 in our book, God is Read. This chapter is called Indians of America. As the civil rights movement began to be eclipsed by anti-war protests and the discovery by the communications media of other racial minorities, a demand arose for additional information about American Indians. This interest was tremendously increased by the Alcatraz experience, and it was further heightened by the continuing efforts of Indian activists across the nation. In an effort to respond to the increasing market for books about Indians and by Indians, a number of publishers eagerly sought out manuscripts on Indians by both Indian and non-Indian authors. Until this development, Indian literature stereotyped the Indian condition, thus hampering rather than helping the intelligent examination of the state of contemporary Indian affairs. Intelligent examination? I don't even know what you're speaking of. The field of literature on American Indians is totally unlike any comparable field of American study. It breaks down into a number of easily categorized viewpoints, which when taken together reveal much more about the conception of America held by the reading public than about American Indians, past and present. A review of the types of literature available on American Indians indicates that insofar as the Indian activists believed and still believe that they could tap the wellspring of hidden white sympathy, the task was almost totally hopeless and futile. With the exception of N. Scott Momaday's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Housemaid of Dawn and Borland's When the Legends Die and Stay Away, Joe, there have been few successful novels of modern Indian life. Little Big Man, Thomas Berger's fantastically successful novel of the Old West, covers Indian life and culture obliquely, and its time period could hardly be said to relate the nature of contemporary Indian life. A great many novels have not even had the success of Little Big Man in attempting to present in fictional format Indian life as it was experienced in the last century. Most novels have fallen into a go in peace, my son style, with the credibility of the plot dependent on the lonely white trapper, gunfighter, or missionary who comes across the Indian princess. The parallel between the unexpected and fortunate event in the Horatio Alger stories that catapults the hard-working hero to fame and the fortunate salvation event that makes the Indian tribe accept the white hero in the Indian novel is no mistake. It is virtually impossible to change cultures or economic status without what would appear to be an almost supernatural intervention. Where other fields of literature have so successfully enabled people to empathize with conditions and cultural variances, novels about Indians have been notably bereft of the ability to invoke sympathy. Rather, they have been dependent on an escapist attitude for their popularity. As a consequence, both the Indian activist movement and the field of Indian literature have suffered tremendously from the inability to invoke an atmosphere of sympathetic reader response. There has been and is no emotional unconscious which can be tapped on behalf of the American Indian insofar as he is a person like other people. His sufferings are historic and communal. This is the lesson which America has learned from its literature on Indians. The communal nature of Indian personal existence is further supported by the presence of a large body of literature on the histories of the respective tribes. Lucy, where are you? All right, why don't you stay over here? Come in your basket, honey. I know you're playing over there. She goes in the one bedroom and she plays, and then she goes into the bathroom and she gets into the garbage, and that's not good. As we all know, garbages and bathrooms can be. I'm just saying. For generations, it has been traditional that all historical literature on Indians be a recital of tribal histories from the pre-discovery culture through the first encounter with the white man to about year 1890. And that's for purposes of all of the museums and artifacts that then take government money in order to be able to continue on with their research and development. At that point, the tribe seems to fade gently into history, with its famous war chief riding down the canyon into the sunset. Individuals appear within the history only to the extent that they appear to personalize the fortunes of the tribe. A mythical Hiawatha, a saddened Chief Joseph, a scowling Sitting Bull, a sullen Geronimo, all symbolize not living people, but the historic fate of a nation overwhelmed by the inevitability of history. Some of the earliest Indian protests challenged this image of Indians and the numerous false stereotypes projected by this type of literature. Sincere but unknowing whites honestly asked us less than a decade ago if we still lived in tents, if we were allowed to leave the reservation, and other relevant questions, indicating that for a substantial number of Americans, Indians were still shooting at the Union Pacific on their days off. The result of this protest was that several writers of books on Indians added a final chapter in which a quick sketch of the contemporary condition of the tribe was reviewed. As late as 1964, many publishers thought, number one, Indians could not write books, and number two, any book written by an Indian would be biased in favor of Indians. Whenever the subject of Indians writing their own books arose, even the friendliest of non-Indians stated that a great many Indians had written books and that we should be content with what they had left. The trail of books written by Indians is significant if considered as the recordings as the recorded feelings of a race once extant, but insignificant if it is meant to communicate modern social and legal problems that have created and intensified poverty conditions among a segment of the American population. So history seems to be great, but what about contemporary Indians? What are they? Do they live in tents? I don't understand. No comprendo. Seriously, I'm right there. Even today, except for I read this chapter already, so I'm a little ahead. Even today, although it didn't really sink in 100%, this is why I love reading this a second time out loud here. Even today, many people feel that the old books on Indians are sufficient to inform the modern American public about the nature of Indian life and to give him sufficient information about Indians for him to make an intelligent choice as to how best to support Indian goals and aspirations. One historian wrote that there are already a sufficient number of books by Indians and that books chronicling contemporary outrages should not be published. See the Bookless Classroom. Because they stir up bad feelings between Indians and whites. He recommended Sun Chief, The Autobiography of a Hopi, published in 1942. The Son of Old Man Hat, The Autobiography of a Navajo, published in 1938. And Black Hawk's Autobiography, published in 1833. Can these books correctly inform the reader on the struggle of the Navajo and Hopi against Peabody Coal Company at Black Mesa? This fundamental cleavage of information about Indians and information by Indians about particular and pressing problems has come to dominate Indian concerns, but it has not even begun to penetrate the non-Indian world. During the years when the National Indian Youth Council was coming into existence and young Indians were attempting to get sympathetic non-Indians to listen to their story, quite often the non-Indian would reply that he was very interested and had recently read Ishi in Two Worlds, a story about the last member of a California Indian tribe who spent his final days as a mascot of a California museum in the first decade of this century. Repeated theme throughout the whole villages. That's Americana. That's all of America. The increasing awareness of younger Indians that something was dreadfully wrong was recorded in Stan Steiner's The New Indians. Is Stan Steiner an Indian? The New Indians, published in 1968. In this book, Steiner reviewed the developments within Indian country since the Second World War. He pointed out the fact that the tremendous sums the federal government was spending for Indian education were beginning to produce results. Rather than a quiet group of civil servants, however, the younger Indians were becoming political theorists, activists, and cultural revitalists. Steiner warned of the impending landslide of concern, which was bound to manifest itself in continuing protests against federal policies that had never taken into account the nature of Indian society or the deep feeling of betrayal the Indian community has held throughout the 20th century. Unfortunately for everyone, the reading public, the literary critics, and many of the people most directly concerned with the problems of modern Indians were attracted to two other books also published in 1968. Alvin Josephy published his famous The Indian Heritage of America, and Peter Farb published the famous book with the long title Man's Rise to Civilization as Shown by the Indian of North America from Primeval Times to the Coming of the Industrial State. I'm asleep. How about you? Both books were bestsellers and popular book club selections. Josephy devoted all of 20 pages in his 365-page book to the period from 1890 to 1968, failing to cite any contemporary Indian political leader at all, and mentioning the National Indian Youth Council once in passing. 20 pages. Farb did a brilliant analysis of prehistoric Indian culture, covered items which had not previously been on any anthropological agenda, and cleverly wove together almost all of the relevant information on Indian culture deviations into a 332-page book. His work considered by reviewers as a major step forward in understanding the American Indians. He did not, however, mention the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which has formed the basis for communal survival in the post-war world. He did not mention the Indian Claims Commission of 1946, which was attempted to redress the injustices of land confiscation through relitigation of land claims. Farb frankly stated that he would leave such a job to another. How he came to figure that he had taken Indians up to the modern industrial state, however, is another question, since his book appears chronologically to stop shortly after the Dawes Act of 1887. The incongruity of the impact of the three books becomes more apparent with the addition of other facts. Josephine and Farb were among the inner circle of consultants upon whom then Secretary of Interior Stuart Udall relied for his knowledge concerning the formation of policy on American Indians. Udall was up for president. I remember that. Lost by a U-slide. Steiner was regarded as an itinerant relic of the Jack Kerouac school of wanderers, a person who could not conceivably possess any information on Indians that would be relevant to the formation of policy. In 1968, the inherent schizophrenia of the Indian image split and finally divided into modern Indians and the Indians of America, those ghostly figures that America loved and cherished. In the next 4 years, it seemed as if every book on modern Indians was promptly buried by a book on the real Indians of yesteryear. The public overwhelming turned to Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and the memoirs of Chief Red Fox to avoid the accusations made by modern Indians. In The Tortured Americans and Custer Died for Your Sins, the Red Fox book alone sold more copies than the two modern books. Each takeover of government property only served to spur further sales of the Brown Review of the Wars of the 1860s, while the Indian reading public was in tune with The New Indians, The Tortured Americans, The Unjust Society by Harold Cardinal, a Canadian Indian, and other books written by contemporary Indians on modern problems. The reading non-Indian public began frantically searching for additional books on the Indians of the last century. The result was the publication of a series of books that were little more than scissors and paste jobs. The anthologies Touch the Earth by T.C. McLuhan and I Have Spoken by Virginia Armstrong consisted of a series of excerpts of the speeches of famous chiefs with a few short quotations from living Indians to give the book a timely flavor. T.C. McLuhan inserted a number of sentimental sepia pictures of old chiefs riding along the crest of the canyon to add further maudlin emotions to an already over-emotional book. The public took T.C. to heart, and Touch the Earth also hit the book clubs. She is now happily living in England, her brief venture into Indian affairs apparently finished, her only accomplishment the perpetuation of traditional stereotypes of American Indians in the public's mind. In addition to the sentimental anthologies, a number of books were rushed into print and hopefully to judgment. They were little more than editing jobs on reports to government agencies. Among them was American Indians and Federal Aid by Alan Sorkin, a study done by the Brookings Institution under the grant from the Donner Foundation. The book was complete and with numerous tables demonstrating Indian poverty, but void of any references to the forces then moving in Indian affairs. Big Brother's Indian Programs with Reservations by Sar Levitan and Barbara Hetrick, a study funded by the Ford Foundation, was published shortly after Sorkin's book. It is distinguishable from Sorkin's book chiefly through its use of photographs as if there really were Indians alive today. The sarcasm here is hard to find, but it's all over the place. In the fall of 1972, there were no less than 75 books on American Indians released. Most staggered into print, received few reviews, and collapsed. It was plain that the initial phase of interest in Indians was over. Then, just before Election Day, The trail of broken treaties arrived in the nation's capital, ready to do battle with the powers that be. In little over, remember story from chapter 1? In little over a week, the administration, the tribal leaders, and a great segment of the American public sat stunned as the Indian activists completed their destruction of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, collected some $66,000 in travel money from the federal government, and set off to terrorize the headquarters of some tribes and field offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Somehow, American Indians had arrived in the 20th century. In order to understand why this particular event occurred, we must try to understand the reception that modern Indians have received as they have tried to communicate their immediate problems to an uncomprehending society. When a comparison is made between events of the civil rights movement and the activities of Indians over the last decade, one thing stands out in clear relief. Americans simply refuse to give up their long-standing conceptions of what an Indian is. It is this fact more than any other that today inhibits solution of the Indians' problems and projects the impossibility of their solution in the near future. And this was written in what? The 1970s? I'll take a look. I think it's coming upon us now in 2025. And they did their dance, and they saw. But people were afraid of the destruction without a doubt. Without a doubt. The fear was real. 1973. All right? Do we think that people are hearing something now? Maybe. Let us pretend that the black community, I put this in a short, I think. I think this was my first short right here. So now you are getting the context of that short, all right? Let us pretend that the black community will receive the same conceptions and reconceptions in the civil rights struggle that the American Indian community has received in its struggle. It is 1954. The Supreme Court has just handed down its famous case, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. The civil rights movement is beginning to get underway. Soon there is a crisis in Montgomery, Alabama, and Dr. Martin Luther King begins to emerge as a credible leader of the civil rights forces. At a news conference, King is asked about the days on the old plantation. He attempts to speak on the bus boycott, but the news media rejects his efforts. It wants to hear about Uncle Tom, the famous black of literature. The news conference ends with the newsmen thoroughly convinced that King is merely a troublemaker, that everything is fine down on the old plantation, and that everything will be all right if the blacks would simply continue to compose spirituals. It is kind of close to what happened. You know, it's not that far off that mark, but still. 2 books are published recounting the blessed days of slavery on the one hand and the cultural achievements of the tribes of Black Africa in the 1300s on the other. They are almost immediate successes on the bestseller list, and the American public worries about the Muslims confronting the primitive tribes of the interior of the African continent and changing their culture. In a desperate effort to raise the issue of civil rights in American society, Martin Luther King writes Stride Toward Freedom. Outside of a few people who seem to intuit that things are not well down south, King's ideas are ignored. 2 new black writers, James Baldwin and Leroy Jones, publish books that have a sporadic, perfunctory reception, and they are ignored. The movement continues to grow with television coverage and feature-length descriptions of the poverty conditions of the black community, prefaced by quotations from Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver to the effect that blacks should remain separate until earning the right to participate in American society. Not too far. The Freedom Rights begins sparking a series of anthologies of Negro spirituals about traveling to the Promised Land. A Negro travel book showing the great migrations in Africa in the 1300s becomes a bestseller. Finally, the movement grows intense as plans are made for a march on Washington. People rush here and there, preparing for the march. The activists down in the Deep South are in trouble. Some have been killed for attempting to register voters. On the literary front, however, things are different. The new book, Bury My Heart at Jamestown, has rocketed to the top of the bestseller list. More than 20,000 copies a week are being purchased. People reading the book vow never again to buy and sell slaves. Sympathy for the slaves is running a fever pitch, while Martin Luther King is downgraded because he doesn't speak for all the Negroes. So here again, all the sarcasm going on here. There was something, here it is. Another point I just wanted to make. There are almost immediate successes of these books. On the bestseller list, an American public worries about the Muslims confronting the primitive tribes of the interior of the African continent and changing their culture. Notice how it's the Muslims that the white America is so worried about. We're worried about the Indians, and we're worried about the Muslims coming in and taking over their culture. Notice that little juxtaposition. As the march gets underway, television finds a new hero, Field Hand Boggs, an elderly black who claims to be 101 years old and a nephew of Nat Turner, is discovered almost simultaneously by the New York Times and the Dick Cavett Show. Field Hand Boggs has copied 13,000 words from Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe and is passing it off as his notebooks, laboriously compiled over a century of struggle. Field Hand Boggs becomes a #1 folk hero of America as he recounts for thrilled television audiences his glimpse of Abraham Lincoln and General Grant sitting on the White House lawn the day that he gained his freedom. The march is conducted in virtual isolation. As the civil rights movement proceeds, the literature shifts its emphasis. Old government and foundation reports, complete with charts and graphs, are trotted out with fancy dust jackets that make them appear to be the latest battle communiques from Atlanta. Anthologies of spirituals become very popular, and those that are interspiced with faded photographs of slaves working in the cotton fields prove the most popular. Introductions to these anthologies sternly inform us that we must come to understand the great contributions made by slaves to our contemporary culture. More than ever, one commentary reads, the modern world needs the soothing strains of Sweet Chariot to assure us that all is well. And finally, Watts, as the section of Los Angeles burns, people resolve to do better. Government officials ask for full prosecution of the rebels, all while handing out $100 bills to the rioters for advising them to go back to Virginia and South Carolina and sin no more. A task force is created of officials of various government departments to study the federal relationship to civil rights problems and to report back its findings no later than 6 months after its authorization. Hey, check the Star report on Clinton and check the COVID report, or the Trump impeachment report. Check any of those reports that were highly publicized. Same thing. What seems ludicrous in the black situation is recounted here is precisely what happened in the American Indian situation without anyone cracking a smile. At the height of the civil rights struggle, for example, would anyone have seriously entertained the idea a 101-year-old man with a tenuous claim to black blood or heritage would truly represent the struggles of the black community? Oh, yeah, they would. Certainly no intelligent critic, would be taken in by such a hoax. Fraud is rarely used when discussing minority groups. Yet it not only happened to American Indians, but a substantial portion of the public yearned for it to happen. Maybe that was the problem with the civil rights movement. They didn't give them what they yearned for. Who knows? What we therefore have been dealing with for the major portion of a decade is not American Indians, but the American conception of what Indians should be. While D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee was selling nearly 20,000 copies a week, the 300 state game wardens and Tacoma City Police were vandalizing the Indian fishing camp and threatening the lives of Indian women and children at Frank's Landing on the Nisqually River. It is said that men read and write history to learn from the mistakes of the past, but this could certainly not apply to histories of the American Indian, if it applies to history at all. As Raymond Yellow Thunder was being beaten to death, Americans were busy ordering Touch the Earth from their book clubs, attempting to indicate their sympathy for American Indians. And as the grave robbers were breaking into Chief Joseph's grave, the literary public was reading his famous surrender speech in a dozen or more anthologies of Indian speeches and bemoaning the fact that oratory such as Joseph's is not used anymore. The tragedy of America's Indians, that is the Indians that America loves and loves to read about, is that they no longer exist except in the pages of books. Rather, the modern Indians dress much the same as every other person, attend pretty much the same schools, work at many of the same jobs, and suffer discrimination in the same manner as do other racial minorities. One can assume that for all practical purposes, American Indians are the same as the other oppressed groups in American society. The most militant literature and underground newspapers have indeed tried to corral the respective minority groups with women and gay people to present a common front, to be known as the Third World against the WASP establishment. According to this mythology, all of the oppressed peoples share more in common as victims than they do as individual groups with the mainstream of American society. This simplification overlooks the obvious historical facts that even historians such as Alvin Joseph keep well in front of their readers. The cultural and social worldview of American Indians derives from a completely different background than that of every other group of American society. Where other groups suffer deliberate discrimination and oppression, American Indians are the only group whose oppression comes primarily from an effort to help them change into replicas of the white men. See, every time I do that, of the white man. Where blacks and Chicanos dare not enter, Indians are dragged by well-intentioned people who cannot leave them alone. Thus it is that the cherished image of the noble red man is preserved by American society for its own purposes. If most literature on Indians and many of the recent books reflect nothing else, it is that there exists in the minds of non-Indian Americans a vision of what they would like Indians to be. They stubbornly refuse to allow Indians to be or to become anything else. Even if they have to resuscitate a 101-year-old figure claiming it to be a Sioux chief, they will have their Indians of yesteryear. Perhaps the sole breakthrough in the field of literature about Indians has been a number of books dealing with Indian religions. For some peculiar reason, several books about tribal religions have come through the whole merchandising process and survived the faddish interest in Indians to present a credible body of work. Ruth Underhill's book, Red Man's Religion, presents a quick survey of the various religious beliefs of the tribes, and as a general survey, it has merit. A recent book by Anthony F.C. Wallace, The Death and Rebirth of the Senecas, approaches the threshold of examination of the nature of Indian tribal regions. religions, but the work is oriented toward a historical review of the reforms made by Handsome Lake and the traditional Iroquois religion, thus dealing only peripherally with contemporary Iroquois religious feelings. Sweet Medicine by Peter Powell is the first recent book attempting to explain a tribal religion in a serious vein. In this effort, it closely follows The Sacred Pipe by Joseph Epps Brown and Black Elk Speaks by John Nehart, which were transcriptions of conversations with Black Elk, the Sioux holy man, several winters before his death in the early 1950s. Nearly all of these books eschew the traditional approach of expositional development as though the authors were dealing with exotica, and the books have a tremendous impact on the Indian people who read them. More than one Indian political organization has based its approach to modern problems on Black Elk Speaks. Almost as if triggered by an unconscious reverence for Indian religions, these books reflect a refusal to bow to popular Indian stereotypes and simply reveal the basic beliefs and ceremonies in which tribal life had been expressed over the centuries. One concludes that whereas other facets of Indian life and political history might be bent to accommodate non-Indian ideas, one cannot twist Indian religious ideas without destroying their underlying integrity. So unified was the outlook of the Indian tribal religions, it apparently was fairly simple to develop the major themes without inserting the value judgments, which were always editorially inserted in the histories and anthologies. And this is very interesting because inserting value judgments is all over Christianity, isn't it? So, and also to understand somebody else's beliefs and give it merit and integrity and respect and room to breathe and live doesn't mean you have to read their religious ceremonies and rituals. That might not be for you, right? So you are not taking on an understanding of somebody else's religion in order to pervert your own belief in Christianity. And this whole thing about heresy and the focus of the Catholic religion on heretics is really none of their business. Why are they casting laws in order to say that something is heretical when they themselves have changed that law, can be seen to change, and are in no position to make that kind of judgment? And even if you are to make that judgment, why would you make it to the point of torture? There is just some other motive for your evilness, just like Teos. Coincidence or not, in the summer of 1972, as Indian country was tensing for the eventual showdown in the fall, two major books on Indian religion were published. One was Lame Deer, Seeker of Visions by John Fire Lame Deer, and Richard Erdos, an autobiography of a Sioux holy man. The book reveals a great deal about the general atmosphere of reservation life and the events in the life of John Fire, who was called Lame Deer by his people. Readers accustomed to the pious rigidity of Protestant tracts on the devotional life were shocked at Lame Deer's casual approach to such taboo subjects as death, sex, and religion, yet from the pages of the book shone a wisdom found in few religious books. Even more controversial was Seven Arrows by Hymenaeus Storm. Seven Arrows is unique, an attempt to make a contemporary religious statement using traditional stories, mythologies, and symbols of the Cheyenne people. Purists who expected a recording of ancient Cheyenne rites and ceremonies in the manner of Sweet Medicine were rocked with the simplicity of Storm's approach, as well as the decided lack of obedience to the anticipated rigid form of exposition. Storm, in great measure, succeeded in stepping outside of a time-dominated interpretation of Indian tribal religion and created a series of parabolic teachings concerning the nature of religion. Few people have understood him or forgiven him. What is most noteworthy about these books is that they give a preliminary form to the most important statements that can be made in an Indian context to illustrate the difference between American Indians and the rest of American society. And they came at a crucial time in the development of the Indian movement and in the development of an integrated sense of there being a field of Indian literature. Young whites had already intuited the existence of some hidden factor in Indian life that made it qualitatively different from the world in which they had grown up. Several years ago, as the Flower Children movement was waning, the books about Don Juan, the Yaqui religious leader, began to become popular. A substantial number of young people took up the Carlos Castaneda books as if they were the final word on Indian religion, and the message of the books began to permeate the counterculture minds. Few Indians recognized anything having to do with Indian religion in the books. Where were the sacred mountains, the healing ceremonies, the tales of creation and historical migrations? Yet for a substantial number of readers, Castaneda played an important tune with his writings. The teachings of Don Juan and a separate reality indeed spoke of a different drummer. It was only with Castaneda's journey to Ixtlan that the books began to take on a discernible Indian shape. As one reflects on the nature of books written by and about American Indians, however, and if one accepts the premise that a different and perhaps separate reality is contained in the Indian religious teachings, then suddenly the body of literature becomes coherent. The tribal histories speak of the integrity of the tribal communities in a way in which histories of other nations can never speak. The writers are able to deal with a steady and rather homogeneous group for a distinct period of time, with the defeat and reduction of the tribe to suppliants or suppliance for the nation's charity. A major change occurs, so that if one speaks of the tribe at all, it must thereafter be of a people who had been shattered by forces so powerful as virtually to wipe them from the face of the earth. The novels make a valiant effort to invoke the feelings of former days of communal integrity and common fate, yet the literary device cannot sustain itself on plot alone, for the era is so far removed from modern experience as to preclude itself from description. What is left is an effort through use of a clipped style of formal English to communicate the tremendous sense of being that existed in the tribes until quite late in their existence. Only the books attempting to survey conditions of all Indians in a general interpretive sweep can be said to fail in their effort to educate us about Indians. It is at this point that Josephine and Farr become farthest removed from the realities of Indian existence then and now. And finally, the anthologies. They blossom like weeds in an untended garden. They contain essentially the same selections. Hardly a collection does not have Red Jacket's reply to the missionaries, Chief Joseph's surrender speech, and Chief Seattle's famous remarks on the signing of the treaty surrendering his homeland. Indeed, if one were to take the anthologies seriously, one would visualize the Indians of old as a collection of poets who happened to be present while the army was fighting some nebulous group in the hinterlands. The anthologies present a sanitized version of the winning and losing of the Trans-Ohio West. Few readers see a bloody, exhausted Chief Joseph in his last minutes of freedom trying to save his tribe. They see a dignified chief, blanket draped respectably across his arm, giving a well-composed finale to the old frontier. It is this very sanitized nature of the anthologies that indicates the impossibility of finding meaning in the field of Indian literature. For most of the century, it has been necessary for people of the different tribes to keep reminding non-Indians that all tribes are different, that they have different histories, different languages, different cultural values, and different religions. So thoroughly entrenched has the idea become, even among Indians, that it has been virtually a gospel that no sense can be made of the general topic of Indians, but each Each and every peculiarity and distinction must be emphasized to interpret correctly tribal uniqueness. The anthologies would indicate, however, that a different situation in fact occurs. The speeches contain a startling similarity from beginning to end. Speeches by Senecas in the 1790s have the same tenor and outlook as speeches by Nez Perce and Yakimas, given a century later. From one end of the country to the other, the selections appear as if they were one general feeling shared by Indians with respect to their tribes, to their lands, to the birds and animals, and to the intrusions of the white man into their lives. We're careful. It's like, I don't even know what they're talking about. All tribes believe something, and who even knows? Who can make even sense of it? That's what they're saying. Where careful distinctions can be made in other areas, unless one is intimately familiar with a certain selection, one cannot identify which Indian chief said what. If there was ever a homogeneity, it is found in the anthologies of Indian speeches. I have spoken and touched the earth. When one considers the nature of the selections used in the anthologies, the analysis becomes even clearer. The one common thing that each tribe experienced was its invasion of its homeland by Western European white men. The similarity in the speeches is not accidental, therefore an important aspect. Almost every speech was given on the occasion in which the tribe was confronted with the need to respond to a consistent opposing force that immediately threatened tribal existence. While we can affirm that all tribes have uniqueness with respect to their attitudes towards the federal government, missionaries, and white society in general, the same basic response was made. It is possible in this sense to identify an Indianness which is intimately shared by all American Indian people, the response made to white society. When whites therefore find an apparent homogeneity in Indian response, they have every reason to feel that they are dealing with a unified social or racial group. Even more, the anthologized selections revolve around those topics which have traditionally distinguished Indian concerns from the concerns of white society: lands, communal existence, conceptions of freedom, Indian religious attitudes and beliefs, the conception of death, and the value of individual existence. It is the fact that many whites have discerned in the historical Indian response a quality of life distinctly different than what they have come to experience in their own society that makes them return to the Indians of yesteryear instead of confronting the contemporary Indians. Strangely enough, American Indians also look to the hero, war chief of the past for patterns of contemporary existence. Insofar as modern religious men incorporate the values of the old days, they are in demand today as teachers. The customs and traditions of a century ago are becoming more and more important to the Indians of today. Posters printed by the activists concentrate on the old war chiefs. Bumper stickers reflect former glories, defiance about lands, and an affirmation of the eventual triumph of the Indian cause. It may surprise Indian and non-Indian alike, but the young people who occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs had a full complement of holy men and held ceremonies several times during the occupation. The impasse seems to be consistent. Indians are unable to get non-Indians to accept them as contemporary beings. Non-Indians either cannot or will not respond to the problems of contemporary Indians. They insist on remaining in the last century with old Chief Red Fox, whoever he may really be, reciting a past that is basically mythological, thrilling, and comforting. This is Dr. Annette Feravich. We have been here for a while reading chapter 3. We're going to move on tomorrow to chapter 4. We are cutting through this book, God is Red, by Vinnie Deloria Jr. I'm assuming it's not Vine. Now I'm assuming it's not Vine. The Religious Question, chapter 4. We come back tomorrow to the classroom. Thanks for joining us here on day 201. I am Dr. Annette Feravich. I'm the teacher here in the classroom. Thanks for joining me.